The old sat in the dimly lit cantina, his 6 eyes reflecting the pale blue glow of the establishment's bioluminescent lighting. Commander had seen more battles than most beings could count, fought against species from across 3 galactic sectors. But the tremor in his primary manipulator appendages told a story that even his decorated military record couldn't fully capture. The younger across from him, a fresh-faced journalist named Ra, adjusted her recording device with nervous precision. She had requested this interview months ago, seeking stories from the great expansion wars for her documentary series. What she hadn't expected was the haunted look that crossed the old commander's features when she mentioned the human conflict. His breathing apparatus wheezed softly as he began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of memories that had festered for over 2 decades. The cantina's other patrons seemed to fade into the background as his words painted pictures of a war unlike any other in galactic history. The Galactic Coalition had been riding high on a wave of successful conquests when they first encountered the small blue-green planet in the outer rim of what the humans called the Milky Way. Intelligence reports had been encouraging. The dominant species appeared to be carbon-based bipeds with limited technological advancement. They had barely achieved faster-than-light travel. Their weapons were primitive by Coalition standards, and their military organization seemed chaotic at best. Remembered the briefings clearly. Fleet Admiral Eth had been practically gleeful as he outlined the invasion plan. The humans controlled only a handful of star systems, possessed no energy shields worthy of the name, and their largest warships were less than half the size of a Coalition destroyer. It was supposed to be a simple pacification mission, lasting no more than a few standard cycles. The first signs that something was different came during the initial probe missions. Coalition scouts reported strange behavior from human vessels. Instead of fleeing when confronted by vastly superior firepower, human ships would often position themselves to protect civilian transports, sometimes ramming Coalition vessels in desperate kamikaze attacks that served no tactical purpose. Secondary eyes dilated as he recalled the first major engagement at the human colony of New Geneva. The Coalition fleet had emerged from hyperspace expecting token resistance, perhaps a few system defense platforms and some outdated fighters. Instead, they found the humans had somehow managed to turn the entire asteroid belt into a weapon. The asteroids had been hollowed out and fitted with primitive fusion reactors. When Coalition ships moved into the system, thinking they were avoiding a minefield, the humans detonated their makeshift weapons. The explosions weren't powerful enough to destroy Coalition vessels outright, but they created massive debris fields and electromagnetic interference that disrupted the advanced targeting systems the Coalition relied upon. What followed was unlike anything in its military experience. Human fighters, small and fast but laughably, swarmed through the debris clouds like insects. They used the interference to mask their approach, striking at Coalition ships with weapons that shouldn't have been effective against military-grade armor. But the humans weren't trying to destroy Coalition ships with their primitive missiles and kinetic projectiles. They were targeting specific systems: communication arrays, sensor clusters, maneuvering thrusters. Each attack was precisely calculated to degrade Coalition capabilities without triggering the automatic defensive protocols that would have made such close approaches impossible under normal circumstances. His voice grew quieter as he described watching an entire squadron of Coalition heavy cruisers become sitting targets. Their crews alive but helpless, as human boarding parties used industrial cutting tools to breach hulls and infiltrate ships that were designed to be impregnable. The boarding actions were where the true horror began. Coalition military doctrine was based on technological superiority and coordinated tactics executed by disciplined, professional soldiers. Humans fought like they were personally offended by the invasion. They used maintenance shafts and air ducts to move through Coalition ships, emerging from walls and ceilings to attack with improvised weapons and desperate fury. Remembered his first close encounter with human soldiers on the captured mining station at 442. His unit had been tasked with securing the facility's central command center, a routine operation that should have taken less than an hour. The humans had already been cut off from reinforcements for 3 days. Their supplies were running low, and thermal scans indicated fewer than 30 defenders remaining in the entire facility. The Coalition assault force consisted of 200 elite shock troopers, equipped with powered armor and energy weapons that could punch through meter-thick steel plating. They had orbital support, full tactical intelligence, and overwhelming numerical superiority. By every metric that mattered, the humans should have surrendered immediately. Instead, they turned the mining station into a labyrinth of death. Human engineers had rewired the facility's industrial equipment, turning mining lasers into anti-personnel weapons and reprogramming maintenance robots to attack anything wearing coalition armor. The station's gravity generators had been modified to create zones of crushing force or weightlessness that disoriented coalition troops, while the humans, who had apparently trained for such conditions, moved through the facility with disturbing ease. But it was the psychological warfare that truly unsettled the coalition forces. Humans didn't fight like soldiers. They fought like cornered animals defending their young, and they seemed to take a perverse pleasure in turning coalition advantages against them. When coalition troops tried to use their superior night vision equipment, humans would create blinding light shows with welding torches and emergency flares. When coalition forces relied on their enhanced hearing to track movement, humans would use the station's communication system to broadcast everything from classical music to the sound of crying children. His manipulator appendages trembled as he recalled the moment he realized the humans weren't just fighting to delay the inevitable. They were studying coalition tactics, learning from each engagement, and adapting with a speed that military logic. The defenders of that mining station lasted for 2 weeks against overwhelming odds, and when they were finally overwhelmed, they had managed to destroy most of the facility's valuable equipment and transmit detailed intelligence about coalition weapons and tactics to other human resistance cells. The journalist Ra shifted uncomfortably, her recording equipment capturing every nuance of the old commander's increasingly agitated state. She had expected war stories about glorious victories and tactical brilliance, not this tale of an enemy that seemed to embody chaos itself. Continued his narrative, describing how the human resistance grew stronger rather than weaker as the war progressed. Coalition intelligence had predicted that the loss of major population centers would break human morale, but the opposite occurred. Each destroyed city seemed to spawn a dozen new resistance cells, each one more creative and vicious than the last. The humans began using their own primitive technology in ways that confounded coalition scientists. They would hijack coalition communication networks using nothing more than modified commercial electronics. They built weapons from agricultural equipment and household chemicals. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to view their technological disadvantage as an opportunity rather than a limitation. Described one incident where human rebels had managed to capture a coalition supply convoy using nothing but modified civilian vehicles and construction equipment. The humans had studied coalition patrol routes and identified a narrow canyon where the convoy would be vulnerable. Then they had spent weeks moving earth-moving equipment into position, disguising it to look like natural rock formations. When the convoy entered the canyon, the humans triggered a controlled avalanche that blocked both ends of the passage. But instead of trying to destroy the coalition vehicles, which were too well armored to be damaged by falling rocks, the humans had buried them. The convoy found itself trapped underground with limited air and no means of communication with the outside world. What followed was a siege that lasted for months. The humans used mining equipment to create tunnels that allowed them to approach the buried convoy without being detected. They would tap on the hull of coalition vehicles, just loud enough to be heard inside, creating a constant psychological pressure that wore down the defenders' morale. Sometimes they would slip messages through tiny holes drilled in the armor, messages that demonstrated an intimate knowledge of coalition military doctrine and the personal histories of individual soldiers. The humans never demanded surrender. They never made threats or ultimatums. They simply maintained their psychological pressure while slowly draining the convoy's resources through a series of carefully planned attacks on life support systems and power generators. When coalition rescue forces finally managed to locate and excavate the convoy 6 months later, they found that most of the defenders had suffered complete psychological breakdowns. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described the interrogation reports from survivors of that incident. The humans had somehow learned the names, ranks, and personal details of every coalition soldier in the convoy. They had used this information to craft personalized psychological attacks designed to exploit individual fears and insecurities. Some soldiers reported hearing voices of dead family members. Others claimed to have received detailed descriptions of their home worlds being invaded and destroyed. The most disturbing aspect was that the humans had never actually entered the coalition vehicles. They had accomplished everything through psychological manipulation and the gradual degradation of the convoy's technological systems. It was a level of tactical patience and strategic thinking that challenged everything the coalition military thought they knew about human capabilities. As the war progressed, human tactics became increasingly sophisticated and disturbing. They began using coalition prisoners not as hostages, but as sources of intelligence and psychological leverage. Captured soldiers would be treated well, even kindly, but they would be subjected to constant questioning about coalition culture, military doctrine, and technological capabilities. The humans seemed particularly interested in learning about coalition fears and cultural taboos. They would study prisoner responses to different stimuli, mapping out psychological pressure points with scientific precision. This information was then used to design psychological warfare campaigns that were tailored to specific coalition species and military units. Described one incident where an entire coalition battalion had been rendered combat ineffective without a shot being fired. The humans had somehow learned that the warrior caste had a deep cultural fear of dishonor in combat. They had created a series of elaborate illusions using holograms and sound projection that made it appear as though the battalion was surrounded by the ghosts of their ancestors, all expressing disappointment and shame at the soldiers' participation in what the apparitions called an unjust war. The psychological impact was devastating. Warriors began refusing orders, engaging in ritual self-harm, and in some cases, turning their weapons on their own officers rather than continue what they perceived as a dishonorable campaign. The battalion had to be withdrawn from combat and subjected to extensive psychological rehabilitation that took over a year to complete. The humans had achieved this result without causing a single physical casualty, but the long-term damage to coalition morale was immense. Word of the incident spread throughout the fleet, creating a climate of fear and uncertainty that made every coalition soldier wonder what impossible tactic the humans would employ next. Paused in his narrative, his breathing apparatus cycling more rapidly as old memories triggered stress responses that even decades of time couldn't fully suppress. Ra waited patiently, her recording device capturing the silence that spoke volumes about the lasting impact of the human conflict on those who had lived through it. When the old commander finally continued, his words carried a note of reluctant admiration that seemed to surprise even him. The humans, he explained, had never fought like a traditional military force. They had fought like a living organism defending itself against infection, with every cell working independently but toward a common goal. There was no central command structure to decapitate, no key strategic target whose loss would end the resistance. Instead, the humans had created a distributed network of resistance cells that operated on principles of mutual support and shared intelligence. When one cell was destroyed, others would immediately adapt their tactics to counter whatever methods the coalition had used. When coalition forces developed countermeasures for one type of human attack, the humans would simply abandon that approach and develop something completely different. The war had dragged on for years, consuming resources and personnel at a rate that made even the coalition's vast military machine strain under the burden. What was supposed to be a quick pacification campaign had become a grinding war of attrition that called into question the coalition's entire approach to conquest and expansion. The cantina's ambient lighting seemed to dim as continued his account, his multiple eyes reflecting memories that had haunted him for decades. Ra noticed that other patrons had begun to gather at nearby tables, drawn by whispered rumors that the old commander was finally telling the story he had kept locked away for 20 years. The real turning point in the war, explained, came when the coalition made the catastrophic decision to target human civilian populations directly. The military leadership reasoned that humans, like most species, would surrender once their non-combatants were threatened. Intelligence reports suggested that humans had strong emotional bonds with their offspring and elderly, making them vulnerable to pressure tactics that had proven effective against other species. The orbital bombardment of New Tokyo was meant to be a demonstration of overwhelming force, a show of power that would break human morale and bring about a swift end to the conflict. The coalition fleet had spent weeks preparing for the operation, calculating precisely how much destruction would be necessary to create the desired psychological impact without completely eliminating the human population's usefulness as a labor force. had been aboard the command ship when the bombardment commenced. He watched on tactical displays as precisely targeted energy beams reduced a city of 12 million inhabitants to rubble in a matter of hours. Coalition analysts predicted that news of the attack would spread throughout human space within days, followed quickly by offers of unconditional surrender from human leadership. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The attack unified every human faction in a way that Coalition had deemed impossible based on their studies of human behavior. Humans who had been fighting each other in civil conflicts immediately ceased hostilities and turned their combined attention to the Coalition forces. Underground resistance movements that had operated in secret suddenly emerged into the open, their membership swelling with volunteers who seemed to view death as preferable to living under Coalition occupation. Response began within hours of the bombardment. Every Coalition facility in human space came under simultaneous attack from forces that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Human civilians who had previously shown no signs of military training suddenly revealed themselves as highly trained saboteurs, communicators, and logistics specialists. The entire human population had apparently been preparing for this moment, turning their society into a weapon aimed at the heart of Coalition expansion. His voice took on a note of bewildered respect as he described the systematic dismantling of Coalition infrastructure that followed. The humans didn't just attack military targets. They went after everything that supported the Coalition's ability to project power into human space. Mining operations, communication relays, supply depots, even the automated systems that regulated environmental controls on Coalition vessels. The attacks were coordinated with a precision that suggested years of planning, but they were executed with a creativity that military logic. Humans would use agricultural chemicals to create improvised explosives that could damage Coalition armor. They would hijack civilian cargo vessels and convert them into guided missiles aimed at Coalition stations. Most disturbing of all, they would sacrifice themselves without hesitation to achieve objectives that seemed to serve no immediate tactical purpose. Described one incident where a human freighter captain had deliberately crashed his ship into a Coalition communications hub, destroying not only the facility, but also taking out 3 Coalition destroyers that had been docked for maintenance. The attack had been carefully timed to coincide with a shift change, maximizing casualties among Coalition personnel while ensuring that critical intelligence data stored at the facility would be completely destroyed. Investigation of the wreckage revealed that the human pilot had spent months planning the attack, studying Coalition procedures and security protocols with obsessive attention to detail. He had even managed to infiltrate Coalition personnel records, learning the names and personal histories of everyone who would be affected by his attack. In the ship's data logs, Coalition investigators found detailed profiles of each victim, written with a mixture of clinical precision and personal rage that chilled even hardened military analysts. The psychological impact of such attacks was profound. Coalition soldiers found themselves questioning not just their mission, but their fundamental understanding of warfare itself. They had been trained to fight rational enemies who valued self-preservation and could be deterred by appropriate demonstrations of superior force. Humans seemed to operate according to completely different principles, treating death not as a failure to be avoided, but as a resource to be expended strategically. As the war progressed, human tactics evolved in ways that challenged every assumption Coalition military doctrine was built upon. They began using their own primitive technology to create weapons that Coalition scientists had dismissed as impossible. Human engineers would combine elements from different technological systems in ways that violated basic principles of physics, yet somehow produced results that worked in practice, even if they made no sense in theory. Recalled an incident where human rebels had managed to create a localized gravity weapon using nothing but commercial mining equipment and modified gravity generators salvaged from damaged Coalition ships. The device shouldn't have worked according to any known laws of physics, but it had been used to create a gravity well that pulled an entire Coalition battle group out of hyperspace and into the gravitational field of a neutron star. The Coalition ships had been too massive to escape the neutron star's pull, but their crews had remained alive long enough to send detailed sensor readings back to the fleet command. The data revealed that the humans had somehow managed to predict exactly when and where the Coalition ships would emerge from hyperspace, positioning their improvised weapon with mathematical precision that suggested an understanding of hyperspace mechanics that Coalition scientists had spent centuries developing. More disturbing still, the wreckage of the gravity weapon showed that it had been designed to self-destruct after a single use, ensuring that coalition forces could never reverse-engineer the technology or develop countermeasures. The humans had sacrificed a potentially war-winning advantage to achieve a single tactical victory, demonstrating a strategic mindset that prioritized long-term resistance over short-term gains. The incident marked a shift in coalition thinking about the nature of the human threat. What had begun as a simple pacification campaign was revealing itself to be something far more dangerous, a conflict with a species that seemed capable of adapting and innovating at a pace that made traditional military planning obsolete. Human resistance cells began demonstrating capabilities that stretched credulity. They would intercept coalition communications using equipment that should have been completely incompatible with coalition technology. They would predict coalition troop movements with accuracy that suggested either prophetic abilities or intelligence networks that penetrated to the highest levels of coalition command. Most unsettling of all, they seemed to understand coalition psychology better than coalition scientists understood human behavior. Described a series of incidents where human operatives had managed to infiltrate coalition facilities by exploiting psychological blind spots that coalition security systems had never been designed to address. Humans would present themselves as refugees, damaged coalition androids, or even deceased personnel whose deaths hadn't been properly recorded in coalition databases. The infiltrators would spend weeks or months gathering intelligence, but their true purpose wasn't espionage. They were studying coalition personnel, learning to mimic not just the appearance but the behavioral patterns and psychological profiles of specific individuals. When the time came to act, these human operatives could move through coalition facilities with an authority and confidence that made them effectively invisible to security systems designed to detect intruders rather than imposters. One infiltrator had managed to impersonate a coalition fleet admiral for 3 months, using the position to issue orders that redirected coalition resources away from critical defensive positions and into elaborate wild goose chases across empty star systems. The deception was only discovered when the real admiral returned from what he had believed to be a routine inspection tour, only to find that his command had been systematically dismantled by someone wearing his face. Investigation revealed that the human operative had extensive surgical modification to alter his appearance, but more disturbing was the evidence that he had somehow managed to access the admiral's personal memories and psychological profile. The imposter knew details about the admiral's childhood, his military service record, even his private fears and personal relationships. When questioned, coalition personnel admitted that they had never suspected the deception because the imposter had seemed more like the admiral than the admiral himself. The implications were staggering. If humans could not only infiltrate coalition facilities but actually assume the identities of high-ranking coalition officers with such precision, then no position of authority could be considered secure. The paranoia that followed led to extensive psychological testing of all coalition personnel, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and mistrust that further degraded military effectiveness. Human psychological warfare reached new heights of sophistication as the conflict dragged on. They began using coalition propaganda systems against themselves, hacking into communication networks to broadcast messages that appeared to come from coalition high command, but contained subtle psychological triggers designed to create doubt and confusion among coalition forces. The broadcasts would start with legitimate military communications, indistinguishable from routine orders and status reports. But embedded within the normal flow of information were carefully crafted messages that played on coalition fears and cultural anxieties. Warriors would receive orders that seemed to question their honor and combat effectiveness. Aquatic Keplerians would find their communications contaminated with references to environmental disasters and water contamination. Each species-specific psychological attack was crafted with an understanding of coalition culture that seemed impossible for outsiders to possess. Secondary eyes dilated as he recalled the gradual breakdown of coalition military cohesion that followed these psychological campaigns. Units that had fought together for years began to fragment along species lines as soldiers started to suspect that their allies were either human infiltrators or coalition personnel who had been compromised by human psychological manipulation. The paranoia reached its peak during the Battle of Prime. when an entire coalition fleet almost destroyed itself in a series of friendly fire incidents triggered by false intelligence reports that suggested widespread human infiltration of coalition command structures. Ships that had served together for decades opened fire on their own allies based on psychological profiles that identified subtle behavioral changes as evidence of human replacement or mind control. The humans hadn't fired a single shot during the battle, but they had managed to eliminate more coalition ships than they had destroyed in the previous 2 years of conventional warfare. The psychological warfare had become so effective that coalition forces were literally defeating themselves while human rebels watched from hidden observation posts and took notes on the most effective psychological pressure points. Coalition morale reached its lowest point following the Prime incident. Reports of psychological breakdowns among coalition personnel became routine, with entire units requesting transfer away from human space rather than continue serving in what many soldiers had come to regard as a war against an enemy that could read their minds and manipulate their thoughts. The humans seemed to sense that coalition resolve was weakening, and they began to escalate their psychological campaigns in ways that pushed the boundaries of what coalition scientists believed possible. Human operatives started appearing in coalition dreams, delivering messages that were so vivid and personal that recipients often couldn't determine whether they had experienced actual contact or simply suffered psychological breakdown. Himself had been subjected to such an experience, waking one night aboard his command ship to find a human child standing in his quarters, speaking in a language that shouldn't have been translatable by coalition neural interface systems, but which he understood perfectly. The child had delivered a detailed critique of coalition military tactics, pointing out weaknesses and vulnerabilities that hadn't even been aware of, before simply fading away like a holographic projection. Investigation revealed no evidence of any intrusion into his quarters, no traces of holographic equipment or psychoactive substances that might have induced hallucinations. The experience had been so real, and the information so accurate that had been forced to conclude that the humans had somehow managed to access his sleeping mind directly, implanting knowledge and insights that changed his understanding of the war. The psychological pressure began to affect coalition decision-making at the highest levels. Fleet commanders started second-guessing orders from coalition high command, wondering whether communications were authentic or part of elaborate human psychological operations. Strategic planning became paralyzed by the need to consider not just conventional military factors, but the possibility that any piece of intelligence might be part of a human deception designed to manipulate coalition thinking. As the war entered its 4th year, it became clear that the coalition was fighting an enemy unlike anything they had encountered in centuries of expansion. The humans had turned warfare itself into a weapon, using coalition strengths against them and exploiting psychological vulnerabilities that coalition military doctrine had never acknowledged existed. The cost in coalition lives and resources had grown beyond anything that could be justified by the strategic value of human space. But more damaging than the material losses was the psychological impact on coalition military culture. The absolute confidence in technological and numerical superiority that had driven centuries of successful expansion was shattered, replaced by a creeping fear that coalition dominance was neither inevitable nor permanent. Paused again, his breathing apparatus cycling with obvious distress. Around him, the cantina had fallen silent, other patrons hanging on every word of a story that challenged everything they thought they knew about human capabilities and the nature of warfare itself. The silence in the cantina was broken only by the soft hum of life support systems and the occasional clink of drinking vessels as patrons listened to this increasingly disturbing account. The old commander's multiple eyes had taken on a distant quality, as if he were seeing not the dimly lit establishment around him, but the star-filled void where his understanding of warfare had been forever changed. The end began, explained, with what coalition intelligence initially dismissed as a series of unrelated equipment failures across the fleet. Sensor arrays would malfunction at critical moments, weapon systems would experience targeting errors during combat operations, and life support systems would develop intermittent faults that created constant stress among crew members without quite rising to the level of life-threatening emergencies. Coalition engineers assumed they were dealing with normal wear and tear exacerbated by the extended deployment in human space. Equipment was inspected, replaced, and upgraded according to standard maintenance protocols. But the failures continued, and gradually a pattern began to emerge that sent chills through coalition command structures. The malfunctions were too precisely timed and too strategically distributed to be coincidental. Sensor failures would occur exactly when human vessels were most vulnerable to detection, giving resistance fighters crucial seconds to escape coalition pursuit. Weapons malfunctions would happen during the opening moments of critical engagements, allowing human forces to achieve tactical advantages that should have been impossible against superior coalition firepower. Investigation revealed that the equipment failures were the result of sabotage so subtle and sophisticated that coalition engineers had difficulty detecting it even when they knew what to look for. Humans had somehow managed to introduce microscopic flaws into coalition manufacturing processes, defects that would remain dormant for months or years before activating under specific conditions. The sabotage wasn't limited to military equipment. Coalition scientists discovered that human operatives had infiltrated civilian supply chains throughout coalition space, introducing similar time-delayed sabotage into everything from food processing systems to atmospheric recycling equipment. The scope of the operation was staggering, suggesting that humans had been planning for this conflict decades before the first coalition ship entered their space. His voice took on a note of grudging admiration as he described the elegance of the human sabotage campaign. They hadn't simply planted bombs or crude, destructive devices. Instead, they had introduced subtle modifications that would cause coalition systems to degrade gradually, creating a constant drain on resources and personnel that was nearly impossible to counter. A water recycling system might develop a microscopic leak that would go undetected for months, while slowly contaminating the ship's water supply with compounds that induced mild depression and cognitive dysfunction. An environmental control system might be modified to produce air with slightly elevated carbon dioxide levels, creating chronic fatigue and reduced mental acuity among crew members. Navigation computers might accumulate tiny calculation errors that would compound over time, causing ships to arrive at their destinations hours late or slightly off course. None of these modifications were immediately life-threatening, but their cumulative effect was devastating to coalition morale and operational efficiency. Crew members found themselves constantly tired, irritable, and unable to concentrate. Mission completion rates dropped steadily as equipment failures forced delays and complications that turned routine operations into exhausting ordeals. The psychological impact was perhaps even more damaging than the practical effects. Coalition personnel began to distrust their own equipment, double-checking every system and questioning every reading. The absolute confidence in coalition technology that had been the foundation of military doctrine for centuries was systematically undermined by the growing realization that nothing could be taken for granted when fighting humans. But the true of the human resistance came not through sabotage or psychological warfare, but through something that coalition strategists had never considered. Humans began to evolve their tactics faster than coalition forces could adapt to them. Traditional military doctrine assumed that tactical innovation was a slow process, requiring extensive testing, training, and gradual implementation across large military organizations. Humans seemed to operate according to different principles entirely. They would develop new tactics in real time during combat operations, communicate these innovations across their resistance networks within hours, and have entire resistance cells implementing new strategies before coalition forces had even recognized that their previous countermeasures had become obsolete. Described one incident that perfectly illustrated this phenomenon. Coalition forces had developed a new detection system designed to identify human infiltrators by analyzing subtle differences in movement patterns and physiological responses. The technology was based on years of research into human biology and behavior, and initial tests suggested it was nearly foolproof. Within a week of the system's deployment, human operatives had not only figured out how to defeat it, but had turned it into a weapon against coalition forces. They had somehow learned to mimic the movement patterns and physiological signatures of different coalition species so precisely that the detection system would identify coalition personnel as human infiltrators while allowing actual human operatives to pass undetected. The countermeasures had been developed and distributed throughout the human resistance network, with a speed that suggested either impossible communication capabilities or a level of tactical innovation that challenged fundamental assumptions about how military organizations functioned. Coalition scientists spent months trying to understand how humans had managed to reverse engineer and defeat their detection system so quickly, eventually concluding that human resistance cells were operating with a level of coordination and information sharing that was theoretically impossible without centralized command structures that intelligence reports insisted didn't exist. As the war entered its final phase, human resistance began to demonstrate capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. They seemed capable of predicting coalition tactics with accuracy that suggested either prophetic abilities or intelligence-gathering capabilities that penetrated to the highest levels of coalition command. Operations that had been planned in complete secrecy would be countered by human forces that appeared to have been preparing for those exact scenarios for weeks or months. The suspicion that humans had somehow compromised coalition communication systems led to increasingly desperate security measures. Coalition High Command began using quantum-encrypted communication protocols that were supposed to be impossible to intercept or decode. Orders were transmitted using code words and mathematical that changed daily according to algorithms that only a handful of coalition officers were authorized to access. The security measures proved useless. Human resistance fighters continued to anticipate coalition operations with uncanny accuracy, suggesting either that they had developed quantum decryption capabilities that exceeded coalition technology by centuries, or that their intelligence networks had achieved a level of penetration that made coalition security measures irrelevant. The truth was even more disturbing. Coalition investigators eventually discovered that humans weren't intercepting coalition communications at all. They were predicting coalition tactics by modeling the psychological profiles and decision-making patterns of individual coalition commanders with such precision that they could anticipate strategic decisions before those decisions were made. Human resistance cells had apparently spent years studying coalition military doctrine, tactical preferences, and individual command styles. They had created psychological profiles of every coalition officer above the rank of lieutenant, analyzing everything from combat records to personal correspondence to psychological evaluation reports. Using this information, they had built predictive models that could forecast coalition tactical decisions with remarkable accuracy. The implications were staggering. Humans had essentially turned coalition military doctrine into a liability, using the predictability of systematic tactical training against the very forces it was designed to serve. Coalition commanders found themselves trapped by their own competence, unable to deviate from proven tactical principles without risking military effectiveness, but equally unable to maintain those principles without telegraphing their intentions to an enemy that had learned to read coalition thinking like an open book. The breaking point came during what coalition historians would later call the Battle of Sol III, the final engagement of the war, and the moment when coalition forces realized that they were not fighting an enemy they could defeat through conventional means. Coalition High Command had planned what they believed would be the decisive assault on the human home system. Every available ship had been committed to the operation, representing the largest concentration of coalition firepower in the war. The plan called for simultaneous strikes against every human military installation in the system, followed by occupation of the planet's major population centers. Intelligence reports suggested that human resistance had been weakened by years of attrition warfare, and coalition analysts predicted that the overwhelming force concentration would finally break human morale and bring about the surrender that had eluded them for so long. Instead, the coalition fleet emerged from hyperspace to find that the entire human home system had been transformed into a weapon. Every planet, moon, asteroid, and space station had been converted into part of an integrated defense network that seemed to violate basic principles of physics and engineering. The humans had somehow managed to link their entire solar system into a single, coordinated weapon system using technology that coalition scientists couldn't identify or understand. Gravity fields fluctuated in patterns that pulled coalition ships out of formation and into carefully prepared kill zones. Electromagnetic pulses emerged from empty space with no apparent source, disabling coalition weapons and communication systems. Most disturbing of all, coalition ships began experiencing what could only be described as temporal displacement, arriving at target coordinates to find that hours or days had passed, while their crews experienced only minutes of subjective time. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described the final moments of the Coalition assault. His own command ship had been caught in one of the temporal displacement fields, and he had watched in horror as the rest of the Coalition fleet seemed to accelerate away from him, moving at impossible speeds before simply disappearing from his sensors entirely. When the temporal effect finally released his ship, found himself alone in a star system that bore no resemblance to the intelligence reports his fleet had been based on. The human home world was still there, but it was surrounded by structures and energy patterns that suggested technological capabilities far beyond anything Coalition science had achieved. A communication came through on emergency frequencies, transmitted in perfect Coalition standard by a voice that belonged to no known human leader. The message was simple and utterly terrifying. The humans thanked the Coalition for providing them with the opportunity to test their new defensive systems, and they looked forward to visiting Coalition space in the near future to return the favor. The rest of the Coalition fleet was never seen again. Quantum-encrypted beacons that should have been impossible to block or disable had simply stopped transmitting, leaving no trace of what had happened to over 3,000 ships and their crews. Coalition search and rescue operations found no wreckage, no escape pods, no evidence that the fleet had ever existed beyond the testimony of and the dozen other ships that had experienced similar temporal displacement. The war ended not with human surrender, but with Coalition withdrawal from human space, followed by an immediate and total communications blackout that had lasted for over 2 decades. Official records listed the conflict as a limited police action that had achieved its objectives, but veterans knew the truth. The Coalition had encountered something that challenged not just their military supremacy, but their understanding of what was possible in a universe they had thought they understood. The old commander fell silent, his breathing apparatus cycling slowly as he stared into the distance at memories that time had done nothing to soften. Around him, the cantina's patrons sat in stunned silence, trying to process implications that reached far beyond simple military defeat. Ra finally found her voice, asking the question that hung in the air like a physical presence. Had there been any contact with humans since the war ended? His multiple eyes focused on her with an intensity that made her wish she hadn't asked. There had been reports, he said quietly, unconfirmed of ships that didn't match any known Coalition design moving through the outer reaches of Coalition space. Communication networks occasionally carried brief transmissions in human languages, messages that consisted mainly of what appeared to be shopping lists and personal correspondence, but which included subtle references to Coalition military installations and fleet movements. Most disturbing of all were the recruitment advertisements that had begun appearing on Coalition communication networks, offering employment opportunities for experienced military personnel willing to relocate to exciting new territories with unlimited growth potential. The advertisements were professionally produced and included detailed information about Coalition military organization that should have been classified at the highest security levels. No one responded to the advertisements, but their very existence suggested that somewhere in the vast darkness between stars, humans were building something with the same methodical patience and terrifying creativity that had made them such devastating opponents in war. Rose from his seat slowly, his aging body protesting the movement. The interview was over, the story told in all its horrifying detail. But as he prepared to leave, he turned back to Ra with one final observation that would haunt her for years to come. The Coalition had learned to fear humans not because they were stronger or more technologically advanced, but because they represented something that challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which galactic civilization was built. They were proof that intelligence, creativity, and determination could overcome any advantage, that no empire was too large or too powerful to fall if its enemies were patient enough and clever enough to find its weaknesses. The humans hadn't just won a war, concluded. They had demonstrated that the age of Coalition expansion was over, that the galaxy belonged not to the strongest or most numerous species, but to those who could adapt, innovate, and evolve faster than their enemies could respond. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, humans were still out there, still adapting, still evolving, still remembering every lesson they had learned about the species that had once tried to conquer them. The cantina remained silent long after had departed, his words echoing in the minds of beings who had thought they understood their place in a universe that suddenly seemed far more dangerous and unpredictable than they had ever imagined.